Harare has actually been out for 10 years now. It came out October.
No, I know this. I was looking at that like earlier. I was like, oh, wow. So, okay,
so I've been around a long
anniversary.
time, you know. Yeah.
And do you know that it's actually
cake.
one of Detlef's favorite books? Because when we started discussing Virtually Yours, the one thing that he was like, oh yeah, can you make sure that you have Tendai Huchu on the program? I was like, okay.
That's true, yeah.
Thank you. God, it's one of those weird things that happens that, you know, the book kind of marks a moment in time where you were and what you did then. And sort of like reading it when you're like 10 years older, it's a strange, weird kind of like sensation. And I've gone through these ups and downs of loving the book, then completely hating it and loathing it because, you know, I was obviously in a different place to when I wrote it, and then loving it again and then hating it, and then getting to a stage where you're like, you know what, it's its own thing, and you just have to respect it for that. I'm sure you've had the same experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was going to be my first question. I was going to ask you, 10 years in, would there be something that you would do differently? Like if somebody said to you, write the Hairdresser of Harare today, what would you do with it? You know, personally, I would say to you, why did you do that to a girl? Why did you bring this dude who was a better hairstylist? But anyway, that's for love.
Well, you know what it is, though, that what I fear is like, if I try to do it now, I would probably overcook it and try this or that, or because, I mean, I was much younger when I wrote it, and I wrote it like really quickly, and I had a certain energy and a certain vibe, and you know how it is, almost like every couple of years you grow into a new self, right? And again, sort of like as an artist, your sensibilities kind of change over time. And I think if I did it, I would probably try to overcook it, and it just wouldn't have the same pulse and the same rhythm that,
and you try to be all
that readers enjoy because it is what it is. Well, nowadays, yo.
Because you'd be dragged, man.
I'm trying to get through this thing without being canceled. You know what I mean? This is the world we live in now. Because now you'd have to deal with sort of like the gender politics, the sexual politics and all that. You couldn't just. I think I was much younger and more naive when I did it, and so there's certain things that I wouldn't do now, because we're
exactly
in a very different world.
But this is where I'm saying to you, what you call it? Why would you do that to a girl? Because somebody would be like, wow, okay, so a man just rocks up and takes Vimbai's job and just does that, like just becomes the best.
Yeah.
Because men are better. Like why? Like how patriarchal is that?
Fight the patriarchy. but those are the conversations that we have now, and so you wouldn't get like a charitable interpretation of what's going on. Completely understandable. And with the way these conversations move now, you know, it's like we're both dinosaurs, because it's like the kids are having a completely different conversation to us. And you know, now there's almost like an awareness that you kind of have to toe the party line. I was actually having a conversation with my friend earlier, and there was this dude, right? I don't know if you monitor what's happening in YA young adult circles.
Oh no, I do. Remember, I am the person who like published the first YA African anthology, just in case you forgot.
Well, there you go. There you go. But but you know that like things like sensitivity readers, etc., are a thing, and you know it's a big thing there. Where
Mm,
if you write a book depicting a character that's like doesn't resemble you, then you
mm.
actually need to get a sensitivity reader to read through the
Unless
thing
they're a
and say,
white
okay,
male.
you've messed up. Well, unless they're white male, fair enough, because everyone knows what they're like, right? So there was this dude in those circles who was a sensitivity reader and, you know, was vocal on Twitter, calling people out for, you know, being ideologically or being problematic. That's the term, isn't it? Until he wrote a book,
Yeah.
and then they discovered that he had problematic depictions in it. So it's almost like it's an endless cycle of virtue signaling and all that. Yeah, it's an interesting time to live in.
So here's a question to you, because I've
Yeah.
had this conversation with a few fiction writer friends of mine. Do you sometimes think that political correctness gets in the way of creative, your creative work? Does it? Or have you got into a space where you're like, yeah, you know, because I understand sensitivity readers, and I've had sensitivity readers, and I've been a sensitivity reader. But do you think that we are in danger of destroying creativity at the altar of, you know, political correctness?
I think that's a
Heavy
very
question,
tough
eh?
one to answer. Yeah, it's a very heavy question, and you know, I sometimes think, you know what, maybe I'm getting old and becoming a little bit more conservative, and you know, who knows? They say that's the arc we all go through, right? But I think that there is no avoiding it, because you know it is a bubble, right? There is this bubble that feeds itself between sort of like literature and academia, and there is this feedback loop that goes on, and that's why we have all this kind of like craziness happening, and and there is no escaping it, because you have to understand that this is an industry, right? Because you might do your thing that falls outside those parameters, but it's got to be read by an agent, and then there is, you know, the publishers and the editors that are keenly aware of these movements, and the people that might be immune to it are only immune to it because of, you know, the commercial clout that they have. So if we look at sort of like the Twitter controversy that's been happening with J.K. Rowling now, she can survive that, because at the end of the day, if you don't publish her, you don't keep the lights in your publishing house on. You know, as soon as you drop her, a new publisher will pick her up. So in a way, she's kind of insulated from that. Whereas if it's a guy like me, and you become problematic, you're fucked, right? Because you're cancelled. And I just look at it and say it is what it is. At the end of the day, it's the phase that we're going through. And after that, you always move into a new era, into a new paradigm, and new problems and new challenges, and that's just the nature. If you really look back at it, you also find that if you go back a few years ago, virtually every African writer I know has this story where they have submitted and been told, yeah, but we've already got a black writer on the books.
Yeah.
Right. Now, that in itself is, yeah, so it's not about the work that you've done, but we're not giving you access simply because, you know, we've got our box ticked. Yeah.
Right.
And that for me in itself is kind of more problematic.
Yeah, but let's go back to the Hairdresser of Harare. And I'm not sure whether you still remember it, because you just came out with a new book, but which is coming out soon. Beautiful cover, by the way, and it's a beautiful read. But back to the hairdresser. Anyway, I couldn't help, like when I was reading it, every time I read it, by the way, Tendai, I couldn't help seeing certain political actors in Zim that you put in that thing? Was that deliberate?
Well, you see, and this is sort of like the thing, and this is the good thing about being an author, because there is definitely like small print, like, and on the copyrights page that tells you that all characters are fictional and any resemblance to living people is purely coincidental. Yeah, it's purely coincidental. Um, but but the whole idea, the whole thing behind it is I mean, the book has a gossipy tone, and it's innuendo, right? So there is a reason, say, Minister M is not named, because it's a lot more powerful when you've just got an M. And if a reader who knows like Zimbabwean political figures and there's M, now M is like the most popular Shona surname, so you can always project that onto someone, right? And that's the whole point of it, because one of the questions that I get asked most often is it real? Did this actually happen? Right? And before, I used to think, what a load of bullshit. I mean, this is fiction. You've got it from the fiction aisle, right? And I absolutely used to hate that question. But I actually realized that over time, if you've created something that makes people think that this can't just be fiction, there has to be more to it, then I think you've actually succeeded in doing something that's pretty rare. There's very few books that you read, very few fictional works that you read and you think, this has got to be true. But on the side of it, the reality is I'm not well connected. I don't move in those circles of like the rich and powerful. I mean, I would love to.
Well, yeah, but like Harare is like really small, so you don't need to be well connected to know what's what in the zoo. And you know this.
Well, it's well, but I'm not a Harare guy. I'm from Bindura, which is like a small.
No, but you see, like this is like
nothing happens.
Bindura is like like Harare extension and stuff. Come on, Tendai, you can't be doing this.
We are proud of our independence in Bindura. Thank you very much. But yeah, I'm happy for people to think that stuff might be real in some way. It's like whatever, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Everyone wants to know. Sorry, go on, Tendai.
No. I was also just going to say, I also think it's one of those things that, because the city is not really often depicted in fiction. It's not like, people have seen like hundreds of different versions of Harare on screen and read about it in books, etc., etc. So when you do have a place that points to certain landmarks and say there is a chance people might think, because it is one of the few accounts they get, one of the few contemporary accounts that they get to read, that there might be something more to it. At least that's my suspicion anyway.
Okay. If you say so. Ndegwa wants to know how long it took you to write The Hairdresser of Harare.
Ndekwa, would you believe it if I told you that I did it in 2 weeks? Well, the first draft anyway. So this was like Christmas 2009. And, forget the festivities. I just had this voice in my head. I knew there was something not quite right about Dumi the very first time I ever laid eyes on him. So what I did, I started typing away. And before I knew it, I had like the first 3 chapters right. But because I was working first, I was so afraid I would lose the voice. And shout out to Sarah Ladipo Manika. I bought her book, Independence. I got myself thinking, okay, I was feeling independent. So I would write a couple of chapters of mine, dip into Sarah Manika's book. And I kind of used that as a metronome to try to regulate my own voice. So I was constantly on it. And that's why you find like a lot of the chapters have like these little hooks at the end, because I had to remember like the next day where I was at with the story and what I was going to do next. And it was a quick process. And the whole thing about it is that's why it's also like a really quick read. The whole thing, you're just meant to devour it in a sitting or two. Yeah.
Fantastic. I actually
But then
believe it because
obviously what
I actually believe it because it also took me 2 weeks to do the madams.
we have so much in
The first
common,
draft.
Zooks. Yeah. I mean, there's
But
a lot of work
do you find that you have to take a longer time to do your books now than you did back then?
Yo, I thought I had the formula, right? I thought, now I just have to work like 2 weeks in the year, take the other 50 off, and that's
and you got it.
Be me. Yeah. I mean, it's nice to be. I think there's something about youth and naivety where you're not constantly like second wraps you within the writing process is your own ego, right? Because there's always like these external things that you're thinking about, like, will this book sell? Will it find a home? And all those things that are to do with your own ego and not the actual process itself that you fixate on as you become older. And that makes it much, much harder to actually do the work.
Right.
Because the work itself, Zooks, when you're in the zone and you're in the story and you've got the voice, and that's like a really beautiful moment. When you're in flow. And the only thing
I know, and you're your characters, and you talk like them, and I know what you're talking about. And I remember when I was doing the madams, and I was having a conversation with somebody, and I was like, I'm going to shoot him, and then my cousin said, what are you talking about? And I was like, oh, sorry, yeah, it's a character, whatever.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I absolutely get you. Detlef wants to know, did you already know how your ending was going to come, what the ending was going to be, or did it surprise you?
I pretty initially, like when I started, the first couple of chapters, I didn't know where I was going with it. But then that night, once I had like the first couple, I actually like the whole night, because like you can't switch off and you're just thinking about the story. And after the first night, I knew the beats, where the story was going, how it was going to conclude. But then how were we going to get there? And that was like the fun bit. Of course, you don't always really end up in the place where you thought you'd end up, because as you're writing, right, you start making these adjustments because of the decisions and the things that your characters have done. So you kind of meander. You don't exactly nail like the ending that you thought you'd have, but I had something pretty close to what I thought was going to happen. And that seems to be like the way I work now. I spend a lot of time sort of like really thinking about what is going to happen within the story, the beginning, the key, the most important beats, and the conclusion. And then I do like a lot of preparatory work before, which makes it easier when I actually get into the process of writing the thing. Yeah.
It looks like we lost Zukiswa.
Oh, well. I think that there was another question that came in, but I can't read sort of like the scroll. So if you could throw it my way, Detlef.
Yeah. It's from Philip. He would like to know, he wrote, I'm looking at the African conservative Kenyan culture, and I'm assuming it's the same in Zimbabwe. So how easy was it having a queer protagonist in your book 10 years ago, and how was it received by the general Zimbabweans?
See, this is, again, this is the thing that when I wrote it, I was still young enough and not really plugged into sort of like the world of literature. Like, so how I start writing is just through reading a lot of books. I'd never been to a literary fest. I didn't even know literary festivals existed for a start. I didn't know any authors personally. All I had was like the writers and artists yearbook to tell me, to sort of like tell me, you know, where to find publishers and what the process was. But I was also like young enough to be outside of those conversations, because again, I don't come from academia or certainly from the humanities background. So these weren't conversations that I was actually having. When I actually wrote it, I thought, okay, there's, you know, because the book functions with some very sort of like simple binaries. You've got, you know, the hairdresser of Harare, male or female, gay or straight, you know, things like that. These really simple binaries that you see through the text. You've also got like oppositions, things like Wimba is very religious, but her brother, the philosopher, is not religious. And so he has a very different thought process to her. So when I wrote it, I mean, those went like considerations for me about how it would be received or what people think, because I just went with what I thought felt right for the story. And that's almost like the most important thing. And this is why I've referred to the fact that as you get older, it's much harder. The hard bit about writing is when you start worrying about those externalities. Whereas when I was younger, I didn't even think about it. It just didn't occur to me. And this is also because maybe before I wrote The Hairdresser, I'd written like 4 other manuscripts that hadn't been published, right? So you were like, okay, I'm writing this. It will probably have the same fate as the other books. So I'm just going to do my thing and send it out. The weird thing when you talk about the reception, right? Generally, when I speak with Zimbabwean readers, the depiction of Harare as a city, the places they've been to, the places they know, the culture, that's more interesting to them, certainly in the conversations that I have, than the queer aspect. Whereas what I find is like with Western readers, they kind of obsess about that and they miss everything else in the book. I don't know if that answers the question adequately. Yeah.
Okay. I think we are such a small group that you can also unmute your phone yourself, because Sarala has another question. Maybe Sarala,
Yeah,
you can
sure.
read yourself your question.
Yes, thank you very much. I teach, I'm a professor of English and I teach at the Namibia University of Science and Technology, and I teach Masters of English. And the reason why I got interested in Tendai Huchu is because one of my students actually is doing her master's thesis on you. And the novel that she has chosen is The Mathematics, the Maestro, and the Magician. So I was, and that's the first time that I read your book, and I was very fascinated with your writing. I think you're a brilliant writer. And I would just like to ask, I was hoping that she would join us, but I think I'll ask this question on her behalf because she's looking at diasporic writing. Do you believe that as a diasporic writer, you have the objectivity and distance to write about Zimbabwean culture? Do you think that you're a better writer because you're no longer living in Zimbabwe?
Well, that's a very tricky question, right? Because it's the whole what if. I wish there was like a time machine where I could go back and live my life differently, as it were. But I think what it is, the main factor I think that makes me a better writer than, say, if I had lived in Zimbabwe is I remember sort of like being in the UK for the first time and going into a bookstore. Now, Zooks, you probably know Kingston's, which is like full of textbooks and, well, then,
Yeah.
it was full of textbooks and a handful of novels here, but it did. you couldn't read anything you want, right? So I remember walking into Waterstones in Reading for the first time and thinking, fuck me, all these books. And it wasn't like the largest bookstore that you can walk into, but I was astounded by just the range of books that were there. And I got hooked. I remember I was reading sort of like a novel or two a week in my early 20s. You know, when you're at that age where you think you'll be able to read every book ever written.
Exactly.
And you start
and every time
away,
you hear a name.
Yeah.
You want to read them and you realize afterward, meh.
And that's what I did. And as well, relatively to what I earned on the minimum wage, a book was worth like 1 hour's work, right? Which is dirt cheap. To give an example, like now the book retails at about $15 in Zimbabwe. And you know, for people making money, you'll be lucky if you're earning like $200 a month, right? You'll be doing very well. And that's a huge chunk of your salary for a novel. So I think if I am a better writer than what I would have been, it's the fact that I was in a society, A, that valued the art form, and B, where the art form was just so easily accessible. You know, I could buy, if I went online, I could buy any book from anywhere, like virtually any book from anywhere. And that for me was like the key factor. But I don't know about objectivity. I mean, it certainly, once you come out of your own society, you also begin to look at things differently, in the sense that there's certain things that you take for granted, right? Because this is how everyone rolls. And then you also have the experience that, well, maybe no, that was a thing where you're from, but people do things differently everywhere. So you're able to, so you're able to question certain things and sort of like reevaluate certain positions that you might just have taken for granted. And I think that's a good thing. I mean, generally for everyone, the opportunity to travel and get outside of your own communities is enriching in a certain way. Whether or not that makes you more objective is difficult, because I think we can only all ever be subjective. Who is objective, right? Because you can only write from the position of your own subjectivity.
Exactly.
And so on that subject, I think I'm a better writer than I was, pretty much just because of the access that I have to works of literature that I might otherwise not have had. One of the things that used to happen some time ago, I used to do a bit of slash file reading for Weaver Press, my Zimbabwean publisher.
Yeah.
And one of the curious things I always used to see sometimes within the slash, right, is the fact that some of the submissions that I read at the time sounded very dated. And you'd be like, whoa, this shit sounds so old, then. The use of the language, etc. But then you kind of realize that, well, this person must be reading like really old books. This is what they've got access to. So when they come into writing, their stuff doesn't sound contemporary, because you know, it's formed by the stuff that they've been reading all this time.
So Philip wants to know, you talked about the cancel culture earlier, and his question is, what are your thoughts on separating the art from the artist, the art from the artist? Like, you know, should we have canceled R. Kelly? Should we cancel people, you know? Or should we be like, oh my God, this song was there in my highlight. By the way, I haven't forgiven R. Kelly for like also destroying my childhood, my teenagers. But there you go. What are your thoughts?
That's a very kind of like difficult area. I think one of the things we've got to realize, I mean, it is sensible to demand that people of influence and power kind of behave in an upright or moral way, right? That's understandable. And it's also pretty understandable for the public to turn around and say, well, we think this thing that you've done is so egregious, we're not going to put more money in your pocket by buying your product, right? We have the same sort of like attitude to corporations. Like, so if there's a corporation that whose policies you don't like, you vote with your wallet and you don't buy their stuff. That's one perspective that I can certainly understand. But there's also the bit where I think, okay, do we expect our artists to be saints? Do we expect them to? Because when we really think about it, and in our most honest moments, I think we're all kind of fucked up, right? I think there's things that you look back in your life, Zooks, and you'll be like, shit, if the world knew I'd done this shit,
I know, right?
Yeah. And we've all got that. And that's what it is to be human. It's to be messed up. So are we looking for art and stuff from saints? Or are we mature enough to expect that there are people that, maybe we're messed up, but they're a bit more messed up than we are, or people that have views that are fundamentally opposed to what we believe in, and we just have to be mature enough to expect that. And I kind of err on that side, because the way I look at it is I'm not one for biographical readings of works. The work of art, for me personally, has to stand on its own, right?
Yeah.
And if I thought R. Kelly's song was bloody good before I knew he was a pedophile, I look at it now, it's still a fucking good song, right? I still think it's a good song. Now, if I'm going to say I'm not listening to it for moral reasons, I still don't think that should take away from the artistic achievement that this flawed human being has managed to do. That's at least what I think anyway.
Okay, but how about if you find out, like, oh, by the way, R. Kelly wrote this song because he just told a teenager to abort or whatever, and you're like, oh my God, I used to love this song so much, which is what happened with me with which I found out, like, he wrote like Michael Jackson's "You Are Not Alone," for instance, and then a song that I really liked, and suddenly I was like, oh my God, he had put somebody through this, and then he came to her and he's like, oh yeah, I've written your song, by the way.
That's a brilliant combo. I mean, R. Kelly and Michael Jackson.
And Michael Jackson, hey?
Madness squared, right? Exactly. But when I look at it, some of the writers that I love are really kind of
problematic.
I got into Russian literature in my early 20s, and I was crazy about Dostoevsky. But Dostoevsky is kind of pretty anti-Semitic.
Shady. Yeah,
right?
I know.
It's pretty shady in that regard, but his work also has, some of these like really incredible psychological nuances that you otherwise wouldn't get from any other writer. The curious thing is, one of the best books about Dostoevsky that I read was called Summer in Baden-Baden, which was like a fictionalization of when he went to some spa or something. And it's written by Leonard Tipskin, who himself was a Russian Jew. But he could recognize that, he could still read Dostoevsky and recognize that there are aspects of it that are pretty dope. I think when you look at it, okay, so You Are Not Alone, the example that you've given, is, when I first listened to it, I thought, okay, this is a beautiful song. Now with everything that you're saying, you can come to a new understanding of that same song. And say, okay, now the song that I thought, it's like when I was younger, I used to love Yvonne Chaka Chaka's, I'm burning up. You remember that song? People of a Certain Generation. I listened to it a few years ago and I was like, Jesus, the innuendo, the sexual innuendo and stuff that is in there is pretty radical, right? When I was a kid, I listened to it and I thought it was just, about firemen and stuff. But the song isn't any less good because I have a new understanding of it. And I think we have to be realistic. The world that we live in is fucked up and it's got dodgy people. And R. Kelly just happens to be one of those dodgy people who was also incredibly talented. And that's just the reality.
Ndego wants to know whether you could please talk about the economics of writing, like how, essentially, how do you live? How do you breathe? What do you eat while you're writing?
The economics of writing, if you're considering writing as a career, my friend, I say, go do accounting, go do medicine, do something sensible.
Be a podiatrist.
Exactly, No, I think, to be frank about it, like any other art form, it's the same thing we think about when we think about footballers, right? You think about Lionel Messi and Ronaldo. But the vast majority of people that play football, like in the lower leagues, they don't make a lot of money. They have other jobs. They're really just as passionate. And writing's pretty much the same, right? You can strike it lucky and make loads and loads of money, or it doesn't happen. But that's a factor that you have very little control over. It either happens or it doesn't. I think though, if you are sort of like going to get into it, then your first passion has to be the work. But pretty equally, you also have to be savvy about that it is business. There is a business side to it. There is like economic realities that, unless you're fortunate enough to have like a really wealthy spouse or like, come from a wealthy family, that you might want to consider sort of like how viable it is, if that's what you want to do, and whether it is worth you taking all that time to create a work that may or may not pay off. So there isn't like a right or wrong way of doing it, but it is almost just to have realistic expectations that you might be that dude that strikes it big, or you might kind of be like the rest of us, just chugging along.
Can we talk about how radical it was? And it's weird that it's radical because it's like 10 years ago and it seems like yesterday. How radical it is that you were the first, possibly one of the first people to write a gay character in Zimbabwean literature.
Well, again,
it's so weird because I'm thinking about it now. I'm like, 10 years ago, why is that radical?
Well, I think the way I sort of look at it, and that certainly wasn't a consideration for me at the time. And the Zimbabwean canon, to be honest, is so small that if you wanted to do the first this or the first that, there is a good chance that you're going to hit it, simply because we don't produce an awful lot of books. I didn't think it was like radical at all, until people told me that it was, people told me that, well, this was supposed to be transgressive or radical. But then the way I was, again, kind of like looking at it was like, yeah, but I mean, so what? Let's be honest, again, back to the economics, right? In Zimbabwe, it's an exception. The first year the book came out, it sold 500 copies, right? And my publisher was ecstatic and was like, look, we haven't sold this many copies of any book and since I think it was Yvonne Vera, I think Stone Virgins in the 90s, right? And 20 years later, we just had a book come out, and I'm looking at it thinking, well,
the Stone Virgins.
That's still like, you know, 500 copies is peanuts.
Like 500, that should have been like a month's sales.
But that's
I know.
a very good year. So it almost gives you like this perspective, right? Because one thing that also sort of like happens in different conversations is people think that I'm an activist or I'm trying to change shit. And you're like, well, no, I just told a story. But really, when it comes to that level of impact, it doesn't change anything, right? You know, it doesn't change anything fundamentally, because it only reaches like the people that can afford to fork out their $15 for a copy, and that's the end of that. Yeah. So in a way, I don't have that sense that it's like so radical or out there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Philip has another. Philip is coming up with the deep questions, eh? So he's got another deep question. He's like,
go for
what
it,
are your thoughts? He says, I should ask you, what are your thoughts on the African story, you know, and on foreigners writing our stories and stuff? I have my thoughts on that, but you go.
My thoughts on that are like, I am so relaxed about it. In the sense, I think the only reason that we obsess about that is because we don't have the infrastructure to tell our own stories. There is something very sort of like curious that happens in the continent, right? So if something radical happened, like right now, Zooks, if something radical happened to you in Joburg, right? It doesn't really matter until I read it from a Western source, right? That's only when it takes on some kind of like significance. And I think it speaks to our own, for me, I think it speaks to our own anxieties, because if you were to sort of like write a story about like Americans, no one would bat an eyelid. No one would care, to be honest, right? Because they've got so many depictions of themselves that they do. Your thing isn't going to, you know, do anything to destabilize those notions. So when it comes to the African story, I think at a certain stage, we almost have to realize that the reason that, well, in my opinion, the reason that we have some of these hang-ups is simply because we don't have the local infrastructure and sort of the ability to get our stories out there in a sense that they make such an impact. Because the stuff that is significant, and this is the same thing whether it's like our books or our film or whatever, that once they have this stamp of approval from the West and they say this is good, then we say, okay, that is a really
it's great,
dope thing. And I think that's why we have this issue that we constantly have to grapple with.
Yeah. Philip, you wanted to hear my personal answer to it. Personally, listen, I'm a creative writer. I'm an artist primarily, and my whole thing is, if you told me that I should only ever tell my story, then I'd be writing stories about cishet Black women who are half South African, half Zimbabwean. It will be very limited, you know. So I think probably the greatest criticism when people talk about foreigners writing African stories, or anybody writing stories, or anybody telling stories, is really when they don't do it with the same nuance and respect and, you know, wholeheartedness. So for instance, the idea, and I've seen this quite a bit, where you know, there's a mother who is nurturing and, you know, giving and whatever, and then there's there's a father who is a drunk and who's, you know, so that these stereotypes that are like upheld in the narratives. And when that happens, when there is no, when there's no nuance in telling the story, it becomes problematic. But as long as a story is well told, you know, I think it's amazing. One of my favorite writers is Abubakar Adam Ibrahim, and his first novel, you know, Season of Crimson Blossoms, his main character is a woman. And seriously, like, I want to learn from Abubakar how to write women, you know, because he does it so freaking well, you know. I'm like, wow, brah, you know. So I think when people make that criticism, the criticism is not actually about the telling of the story, it's whether the story is told to project what people like. But we don't have much time, and so I need to ask you, shush, tonight. It's almost time up, dude.
You're joking.
I feel like we've just started talking.
You are joking.
I am not joking. But anyway, before we go away, before I, you know, I cancel you. I wanted us to talk about your new book, The Library of the Dead. You do something infinitely different from your other works, because your first two works are like, you know, you know, the realist fiction, if you will. And then in this particular book, you go on and you bring on the spirits. You are like talking. I was just like, yo, this
Hello.
So it looks like we lost her again.
She's gone. I thought it was just me. I think where Zooks was going with this was like with the Library of the Dead being different to sort of like my first two novels. Over the years, I have been working quite a bit in genre fiction.
guy, when this book gets
Oh, she's back.
Not really.
Not really. Yeah, so I've been working a bit. Oh, Zukiswa, hello. You kind of completely disappeared there. So we only caught bits and pieces of what you were saying. But I was already in to say, you know, over the years I've been working in genre fiction, and one of the reasons that I did that was to work on my writing skills, in the sense that when you are doing, say, crime fiction, you learn on a different skill set than you do to doing sort of like your fantasy, or, you know, your sci-fi or your literary fiction, right? And it was a good way to sort of like, you know, really work on different aspects of my craft. This new book, The Library of the Dead, actually, the main character started off in a story that got published in 20. Hello, can you guys hear me? Everyone's kind of like disappearing off.
Yes,
I don't know what I'm.
And
Oh,
can.
brilliant!
Yes, we can. Yeah.
Brilliant. So the book started as a short story that I published in Electric Spec, and I remember the character just didn't leave me. This was about 2015 or early 2016. It came out in a magazine called Electric Spec about a little girl who spoke with ghosts for a living. And it was set in my hometown of Bindura in Zimbabwe. I so wanted to use that character. I knew the character had legs and could do more, right? And then I did another story called The Library of the Dead that came out in 2017. That was about this secret library where they used to take human bodies and convert them into books, and you would have people coming in to read the books. So once I did those, I knew I wanted to do a novel with this little girl. She was nameless at the time. And I liked this other library dimension, and that I could do a mashup. But now, initially I wanted to do it in Bindura, my hometown, but it's a really small town. and thought, okay, I need to move these characters somewhere else. So I moved them to Edinburgh. Now, Edinburgh is a small city. It's only got like 300,000 people that live in it. But what it lacks in size, you can get an extra layer of depth in terms of the history of the city and its people, etc. So you've almost got this length, width, and then you've got this extra depth, which is time. So now you can tell a sort of like 3D story by adding these layers of history. And yeah, it was a lot of fun to do, sort of like playing around with the characters. There's a lot of Scottish history in it. And I think Zukiswa had said something about writing characters that are not yourself, because I found myself using quite a bit of Scots. And for those that, because Scotland is its own it's its own separate country from England. I know that's a bit hard to believe when you're outside of the UK, but you do see those distinctions a lot when you live here. For example, when I go down to England, it really does feel like going to a foreign country. But when I was working in all these sort of like historical elements, I also knew that language would be a big part of it. So I started to use Scots. And Scots is its own sort of like separate language that sounds like English, and they're mutually intelligible. But certain words are different, and it has its own sort of like grammatical structure that is different from England, and Scotland really used to be pretty, it had its own sort of like literature that is very distinct from English literature. If you think about figures like Robert Burns, the poet, and the like. And so what I wanted to do was to work in some of those like local nuances of working within the Scots language, and that was an awful, that was a lot of fun. And you also can't discount the fact that Edinburgh is the home for this woman. She lives there, so something had to rub off. I had to have a go at fantasy. I know that's a very sort of like long-winded answer to a half question. Did I make any sense at all?
Yes. Just Zukiswa disappeared again. Today we have unfortunately a lot of problems. I'm very sorry for that, but sometimes it's out of our hands. Eh? Yeah. No, it does. It does. In the meanwhile, while you were talking, I was thinking about how African is then the news story, the library of. No, what is the title? The library of the dead.
Of the dead.
Yeah. Yeah, because
you were thinking what?
How African is that story?
Well, the lead character, Ropa Moyo, is of Zimbabwean descent. But she was born and raised in Scotland, so she's pretty much, Scottish. But one of the ways she talks to the dead is she uses the mbira, right, which is like your traditional instrument for
I know
ceremonies to do with communing with the ancestors, etc. And that's how she accesses this magic. And I think in part it was almost inspired by the fact that I have friends who have kids. I don't have any kids myself, but my friends who have kids will tell you that they have this weird sort of like disorienting feeling that their kids aren't quite the same sort of like Zimbabwean that they are. And they have very different sensibilities. So I wanted to play around with some of those like cultural elements, but it leans very heavily on sort of like the Scots. But I think though that whatever I write is going to be African, simply because I am African. Even if it depicts a certain Scottishness, it's an act of ventriloquism as opposed to the real thing itself. But yeah, it was a lot of fun, and sort of by doing those things, I found myself sort of like weaving elements of sort of like Zimbabwean or African history in general, in with Scottish history, and there are reasons for this. That the history, when you read the book, at the moment it's planned to be a series of 5 books, but when you read them, you actually realize that what is driving the story is like this long old history that is sort of like bubbling back to the surface. Yeah.
Oh, you said this is it's planned a series of 5 books, so there are more libraries coming in.
Yeah, I'm actually working on the second book at the moment.
Okay.
Which has been tricky and taxing. The idea, inshallah, is to have them released 1 book a year, which is very challenging. But it's also an awful lot of fun, because working in fantasy without some of the constraints that you get in realist fiction, it really stretches out your powers of imagination. And then the fact that I have to do a lot of historical research to get certain things right is also interesting. And you also have the dimension that with the first book about to come out, some of the creative decisions that I made then are playing out in the subsequent books. So I would hope that all the books you can read them individually, but the whole point is you'd get the full story if you read all 5. Yeah.
Okay, that's great to hear. So the that book, the Library of the Dead, is only in, it's in English, or it has been translated already?
The German version was supposed to come out next year from Glenn Vallet Verlag, but because of like the coronavirus, a lot of like publishers had to shift their publishing schedules again, because people weren't able to. So it's been punted over to early 2022.
Okay.
So you've got the British version coming out in February, the American version coming out in June, and then that will come later. The translations will come later.
Yeah. You told me in an email that you might go to South Africa end or middle of the year, end of the year. Is that also related with your work as author, or just private?
Yeah, well, that is related. There's sort of like a tentative invitation that I was given, but everything kind of hinges on the viruses we know. But we're hoping with the vaccines and out that by next summer or winter, from your perspective, that hopefully, if it's possible to get vaccinations and things like that, then we should be much freer or less constrained than we are now.
Yeah.
And so I hope to do sort of like a little, traveling through the region, sort of like a bit of mix of business and pleasure.
Okay, so we hope, of course, to see you also in Windhoek, at our wonderful country, and because for us, South Africa is just next door, Cape Town, and just 1,500 kilometers, nothing.
Well, I would hope you guys invite me. It would be good to. I mean, as great as Zoom is, it's not the same as being in a room. Like if we were in a room, I don't think Zukiswa would have just disappeared. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but she might be back. I see an iPhone, but looks like she can't talk.
That's all right.
Yeah.
I mean, were there any other queries from sort of like our wonderful audience that seems to have, or are they all asleep now?
Yeah. No, I think they're all awake. I lost a little bit now the chat while I was looking for Zukiswa. Is there anybody who would like to raise up a question which I did not see, so that you can unmute? Yeah, please.
Yeah, because I did ask in the chat, but I think it was okay. Let me just go dive into the question. Yeah, I was curious about the fact that there are a number of Zimbabwean writers. Um, I know, I mean, I know there are Nigerian writers, but if you look at the Southern African region, for instance, in Namibia, we don't have so many writers writing fiction. And South Africa, there are, but can you try and kind of unpack this for me? Why do you think Zimbabwean writers write?
Well, it's, I suppose in terms of population, I think we've got a few more people in Zimbabwe than we do in Namibia. So that might be one factor. I also think that when we think outside of the stories that get to be told, right? When we really plug into the commercial side of the business, what stories get told, right? You then see something pretty curious happening. So, like, you get a lot of South African literature, but South Africa, given sort of like the history and stuff, right? Everyone knows where South Africa is on the map, and all the madness that has happened before in the past, and the fact that they have their own sort of like domestic publishing industry going on. That might be a factor as to why you see so many kind of like books coming from South Africa. Whereas if you look at Namibia and Botswana, I mean, they're relatively stable. They don't do a lot of crazy shit. I mean, nothing compared to what we do in Zimbabwe, right? And so Zimbabwe kind of has an interest, because I suspect the reason would be if you are publishing executive for a multinational corporation and a manuscript landed on your desk, one that was from Zimbabwe that pops up in the news every so often, and another from Namibia that's, never on global news for anything shady, or seldom, never is too strong a word, then you might be more inclined to think, okay, we can sell this thing from this, country that at least has that stereotypical African vibe of doing crazy shit. I think that might be a factor, and Nigeria, you've got a huge population there, and it's got its own dynamics. So I think these are the things that you end up seeing when it comes to what sort of books get published, because once you almost realize the fact that the creativity, I mean, the work itself, right? The artistry is one factor, but when they decide what books to publish, there is a marketing department that looks in and says, can we sell this product?
Yeah.
All right. Okay. And that's why when people have complained in the past about poverty porn or whatever kind of representations you find, it would be there's tons of people writing, tons of people submitting books. Like I know, loads of unpublished writers that are generating work, and it could be that they're not being published because the work isn't good enough. And I've told you in this conversation, I had 4 manuscripts before I hit the Hairdresser of Harare. So it could be the quality of the work, but it could also be what is deemed commercially viable.
Yeah. I think you have a sufficiently large Zimbabwean population to read writers from Zimbabwe, and that's the reason why publishers are willing to publish the books. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Thank you for the answer.
No, that's all right. And I think Ndegwa had a question as well. Maybe if you could vocalize it.
I'd like to ask this question the same way I wrote it, because so I was thinking about the conversation we had last month when Zooks was hosting Jennifer Nansubuga Makumbi, and one of the things that came up is storytelling in itself, and it got me thinking about definitions like highbrow, and how different writers come up with different works, and when you open a page, it's easy to see where the writer's emphasis is on. So while you're penning a book and with hitting home in mind, does the narration matter to you, or are you the kind of writer who wants the art itself of writing to supersede.
Yeah, it's different sensibilities. I think though, when you look at the books that stay with us, or certainly books in the canon that people love to read, I don't think Charles Dickens was highbrow, because those books are so entertaining. For me, I think the storytelling side of it for me is kind of like, it's really key. The thing about highbrow literature, have you ever read sort of like a book and you've worked really hard laboring over every sentence,
Yes.
and you get to the end of it and you think, yeah, but I've done all this hard work, but there is nothing new in this for me. That's not to say that, I mean, certain books do, will open up these like incredible perspectives for you. And so I wouldn't denigrate anyone who likes working sort of like in that highbrow style. It's a style, it's a sensibility, it's what the artist is about. But I think ultimately what remains with readers is the story. And that's why you end up with crazy situations when people look at really popular books that they consider lowbrow, and they're really annoyed that the reading public is engaging with these works and not engaging with their highbrow stuff. But then you say, okay, all these big ideas that you claim to be elucidating or whatever, we've seen all this before. It has to be, if you're going to get me to do work to read your novel, you bloody well have to come up with something so radical and so original that I've never seen before. And having read a lot, it's very difficult to get that effect from me.
Yes, thank you so much.
Yeah. Hello, Zukiswa.
Zukiswa, we hardly can hear you. You're breaking up. I don't know if it's only me, but
ancestors were working against you, Tendai. Do you imagine?
We can't
Yes,
hear you.
Detlef, can you hear me?
I could understand what you're saying, but you're breaking up.
You can't hear me.
Now it's better.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. So Kiswa, I think now we can hear you. I think it's also time to round up a little bit. We were late, but it's already 20 minutes past 4. We want to keep you, we don't want to keep you the whole afternoon, and we still have some work to do. Before you round up yourself, I would like to let you know, I put in my coffee mug, I put all the names of the people they showed up in the meeting so that we can draw some winners. That makes it maybe a little bit easier.
Yay.
Oh, fantastic. So you do the pickup.
I just do the draw, but
so you do the pickup this time.
Yeah, I can, because
all right.
to the
so thank you, everyone.
To the technical problems. I said due to the technical problems, a lot of people could maybe not join, and the people they showed up maybe not the same that on the list and the invitation list.
Absolutely. So yeah, thank you, everyone. This has been another fascinating discussion of Virtually Yours with Tendai Huchu. I'm really, really sorry we couldn't talk as much because of technical problems on his new book, which I absolutely enjoyed. But as soon as it comes out next year, please go and get yourself a copy of the Library of the. You absolutely need to get the Hairdresser of Harare, a funny, witty take on the situations in the hair salon. Thank you so much, Tendai, for agreeing to be part of this. And thank you, Detlef and Goethe-Institut Namibia for providing the platform. Detlef told me some great news, everybody, and we shall be having Virtually Yours. This was a test for the first 3 months, but because of the way it has been going and the way everybody is engaged, we shall be having Virtually Yours going on next year again. So look out for us in February. We'll let you know. And a happy holiday to everybody.
Okay, thank you very Zukiswa. Thank you very Tendai. I will draw the first name, Belinda. Belinda, maybe she is out, but she was in. Belinda, I hope. The problem is now if I can't get hold of her, if she's not on the list, I will check. The next name is Ranka. Ranka, congratulations, you're still on. You get a copy of
Ranka is likely still on.
What did you organize? What is the
Hairdresser of Harare? They will send it to you.
Guys, I have it. Please give it to somebody else.
Okay.
Can you send me?
Okay, all right. Thanks, Ranka.
Guys, could I please have a freebie of the Library of the Dead?
Oh, you might want a new book.
Like all 5. And like the minute they come out, because I was here today, I'm entitled. Thank you.
Okay.
We got you, Ranka.
Maybe.
Or rather, Tendai's got you.
Thank you. Also, now that I'm here, please, could you tell us where the recording will be posted? Because I would like to listen to all of it. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, I will send it to you, Ranka. Zukiswa, guess who I draw now? Ndegwa.
No, you can't be talking about Ndegwa.
Yes, I win again.
Ndegwa is not a thing. Ndegwa should not win anything.
Didn't they win the last time?
Look,
This
you're
is
an enemy of
Ndegwa should
Zimbabwe.
stop winning. Ndegwa should be banned from winning.
Yeah.
How does somebody win 3 out of 3 virtually yours? No.
I'm lucky. I'm just lucky.
The next one is Rieko. Rieko, you want a copy? Are you here?
Yes, I am. That's awesome. Yes.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
So I'm not sure if I've got your details. So please, do you have a Zukiswa? I'm not sure if I have all the emails.
I think you do have. I have registered for both.
Okay.
Yeah, if she's on the email list that you sent me, then I do have her details.
Good. Number 4 is Jacob, also still here. Congratulations, Jacob.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy. Thank you.
And the last one, Barbara Sommer. Congratulations. So
thank you so much. Thank you.
Our last copy goes to Kampala. Is it Kampala, no? I'm correct.
Yes.
Yeah. Great. So then I'm also
Sarala?
Yes.
Sorry, one moment left. Sarala, you can absolutely bring your students in February when we come back. The more the merrier. We want to have as many people as possible. So yeah.
Thank you very much. This is just great. Thank you. Fabulous. I'd like to wish everyone a wonderful festive season. This is so exciting.
Yeah, same to you. So we will see us in February again. And like it became a kind of tradition.
I have a question.
Okay, Ndegwa.
Why are we assuming January doesn't exist? I just want to know.
No, we do not start in January because The series is every 2nd January, and I'm coming just out of my holidays. So meaning there is no time to prepare. The people start in Namibia, they start
But
slowly.
also,
you know,
Nego, because you can't be winning in January.
No, Zook, no.
Ego should be banned. It's not fair to the rest of us.
You
You know?
I mean, you have to come and learn from me.
So now I tried to share. Oh my God, I tried to share my screen, but it looks like yeah, now it's working. Like it is tradition, we close with a song. And for the last time, I choose again my friends Melissa Brothers. So please stay on, listen, and you can follow the chat and lay your back for the song "Set Me Free." And again, Tendai, thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you again.
That's a banger. That was a tune.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye, and thank you so much.